Close your eyes for a moment and picture Istanbul, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the face of the earth. A place where civilizations did not merely pass through, they collided, merged, flourished, and fell. Where the Byzantine Empire gave way to the Ottomans. Where merchants carrying silk from Chinese looms and spices from Indian coastlines once navigated treacherous mountain passes and sun-scorched deserts to reach the markets that connected the known world. Where east has always reached toward west across the shimmering divide of the Bosphorus Strait. Now picture a freight train pulling into that ancient city. Not a relic from some bygone industrial era, but a modern, electrified locomotive hauling containers packed with electric vehicles assembled in Shanghai, precision machinery manufactured in Chongqing, and consumer electronics produced in Shenzhen. This train has traveled nearly 10,000 kilometers overland. It has crossed the steppes of Kazakhstan. It has moved through the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia. It is threaded through the emerging corridors of a new Silk Road that is being constructed not by ancient merchants on camelback, but by engineers with satellite positioning systems and state financing measured in the tens of billions of dollars. It has done all of this without crossing a single meter of Russian territory. That train is no longer a vision or a think tank projection. It is becoming operational reality. And at the center of this transformation sits a proposed agreement so vast in its financial scale, so consequential in its strategic implications, and so deeply charged with geopolitical meaning that it has simultaneously captured the attention of railway engineers, global economists, NATO defense planners, and trade ministers from Brussels to Beijing. We are talking about a proposed $60 billion Chinese investment into Turkey's railway infrastructure, an agreement that, if fully realized, would do far more than modernize the transport network of one nation. It would fundamentally restructure how goods move between the world's largest manufacturing economy and the world's largest consumer market bloc, creating a new commercial artery that bypasses the geopolitical fractures that have disrupted established trade routes and redraws the invisible map of global economic power. I'm Nico, and welcome to Frontline Reports. Today we are going deep into one of the most consequential infrastructure stories unfolding anywhere in the world right now. We will examine the history that made this deal possible, the geopolitical pressures that made it necessary, the economics that make it attractive for everyone involved, and the serious complications that could prevent it from reaching its full potential. Because this is never simply a story about trains and tracks and tunnels. This is a story about which nations get to sit at the center of the 21st century's most strategically important supply chains, and which ones find themselves on the margins of a global economy that is reorganizing itself at a speed that most people have not yet fully appreciated. Let's begin. To understand why $60 billion is now on the table, you first need to understand what broke and how suddenly it broke. For decades, when China's factories loaded freight onto trains bound for European customers, those trains followed a single dominant path: the Trans-Siberian Railway. Stretching more than 9,000 kilometers across the vast Russian landmass, this was the established spine of overland Eurasian commerce, a route that had been operational in various forms for over a century, and that had been progressively integrated into China's growing export economy since the launch of the China-Europe Railway Express service in 2011. The Trans-Siberian route had genuine advantages. It was established infrastructure with known operating procedures. It was faster than ocean shipping for time-sensitive goods. It was, at least by the standards of complex international logistics, reasonably reliable. Freight operators knew what to expect. Logistics managers could plan around it. The Northern Corridor, as it came to be known in trade circles, was not glamorous, but it worked. Then came the morning of February 24th, 2022. Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine detonated the assumptions underlying the Northern Corridor, with consequences that are still reverberating through global trade flows today. Western sanctions against Moscow cascaded rapidly through the international business community. European companies that had been moving goods through Russian territory began receiving uncomfortable advice from legal teams and insurers about the risks of continued engagement. Logistics firms that had built business models around the Trans-Siberian route found themselves fielding urgent calls from clients who needed alternatives, immediately, if possible, or as quickly as alternatives could be identified. The technical reality was that freight trains could, strictly speaking, still legally traverse Russian land under the regulatory frameworks that existed in 2022, according to European Parliament studies conducted in that period. But legal permissibility and commercial viability are different things entirely. The insurance costs associated with routing goods through a country under comprehensive Western sanctions, the reputational exposure for European and American corporations whose supply chains were visible on Russian territory, the genuine uncertainty about whether sanctions regimes might tighten further and strand goods in transit. All of these considerations pushed shippers toward alternatives even before any formal prohibition existed. And simultaneously, the Trans-Siberian route was confronting a completely separate problem that had nothing to do with the Ukraine war raw capacity. China's manufacturing engine had been producing goods at volumes that were straining every aspect of the global logistics system. European buyers were demanding faster delivery windows than sea freight could reliably provide. The demand for overland rail freight between China and Europe had been climbing steadily for years, and Russia's railway infrastructure, extensive as it was, simply had not expanded fast enough to accommodate the surge. The numbers illustrate the scale of the growth pressure. When the China-Europe Railway Express first launched in 2011, it carried a total of just 1,420-foot equivalent container units, a figure so modest that it is difficult to reconcile with the system's current scale. By 2022, annual volumes had reached approximately 1.6 million TEUs. By 2023, the figure climbed to 1.9 million TEUs across 17,000 individual train journeys, representing an 18% year-on-year increase. By 2024, the system was handling 2.07 million TEUs across nearly 19,000 train trips. These were volumes that the northern corridor through Russia and Belarus was increasingly struggling to absorb. Bottlenecks multiplied. Transit times extended unpredictably. The system that had seemed so reliable was revealing its structural limits precisely at the moment when geopolitical events were making its political reliability equally questionable. The question that had been forming quietly in the background for years was suddenly urgent. Was there another way? The answer to that question had been developing for years in the margins of trade geography, acknowledged by specialists, studied by logistics researchers, but largely ignored by the mainstream of global commerce. It is called the Middle Corridor. Its formal designation is the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, and it follows a path that would have been recognizable, in spirit and in actual geography, to the merchants who traveled the original Silk Road more than 1,000 years ago. Here is how it works in practice. Freight originating in Chinese manufacturing centers, Shenzhen, Chongqing, Urumqi in the western Xinjiang region, travels by rail westward through Kazakhstan to the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea. At that point, the goods transfer from rail to ship for the crossing of the Caspian itself, a body of water roughly 1,200 kilometers long that sits landlocked between Central Asia and the Caucasus, with no connection to any ocean. On the western shore, the cargo arrives at the port of Baku in Azerbaijan, where it transfers back onto rail to continue its journey. The train then moves through Georgia and enters Turkey via the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway, a line completed in 2017 through a cooperative investment by Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey that specifically aimed to create this east-west connection. Once inside Turkey, freight moves westward toward Istanbul and the crossing point into Europe, either via the Kapıkule border with Bulgaria or through other established entry points into the European Union. The defining characteristic of this route, the feature that makes it uniquely valuable in the post-2022 geopolitical environment, is what it avoids entirely: Russian territory. Not 1 kilometer of the Middle Corridor passes through Russia or Belarus. The route is structurally and completely independent of the sanctions-complicated Northern Passage. The institutional foundations of the Middle Corridor were formally established in 2013 in Astana, when the governments of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Kazakhstan created a coordination committee to develop and manage what they then called the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route. 2 years later, in 2015, the first test cargo completed the full length of the corridor from China to Europe, a proof-of-concept journey that demonstrated the route's feasibility even if its commercial volumes remained modest. Since that inaugural transit, the growth has been steady and then accelerating dramatically. According to data from the Baku Research Institute, annual cargo volumes along the Middle Corridor grew from approximately 350,000 to 530,000 tons in 2020 and 2021 respectively, figures that were already showing strong trajectory before the Ukraine war redirected trade flows with sudden force. The Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway alone, originally engineered to handle 6.5 million tons of freight annually, now has expansion plans targeting 17 million tons capacity by 2034, a scale-up of more than 160% that reflects the anticipated demand surge as the corridor develops. But every logistics expert, every trade economist, every government official who has studied the Middle Corridor in depth eventually arrives at the same conclusion, and at the same single word that summarizes its most significant remaining challenge: Turkey. Turkey is both the most promising element and, honestly, the most limiting element of the Middle Corridor. It's the country that gives the route its European connection, its geographic logic, and, its transformative commercial potential. But it's also the country whose infrastructure deficiencies, more than any other single factor, prevent the corridor from operating at the capacity and reliability that global freight operators really require. Jaijant Menon, a senior fellow at Singapore's ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, described the situation with notable directness in an interview with the South China Morning Post. Turkey, he explained, represents what he characterized as the weak link in the rail network connecting China to Europe. His assessment carried a practical warning. One break in the chain means the entire network fails to function as intended. The specific infrastructure weaknesses Menon and other experts identify are concrete and consequential. Large sections of Turkey's existing railway network run on diesel traction rather than electric power, a technological gap that limits speed, raises operating costs, and makes Turkish lines incompatible with the high-frequency, high-capacity freight operations that modern intercontinental logistics demand. Significant portions of key routes are single-track, meaning trains moving in opposite directions must coordinate precisely to avoid blocking each other, a constraint that fundamentally limits throughput capacity. There is no high-speed freight connection between Istanbul, the city that physically straddles the boundary between Europe and Asia, and Ankara, the national capital. Critical sections of the network are aging in ways that require either comprehensive maintenance or complete replacement rather than incremental improvement. Without serious, large-scale infrastructure investment, not the modest upgrades of routine maintenance budgets, but the kind of transformational spending that reshapes a nation's transport geography, Turkey will remain what it has been for the Middle Corridor: a promising gateway that consistently underdelivers on its potential because the physical infrastructure just cannot sustain the commercial ambitions layered upon it. This is precisely where $60 billion enters the story. In January 2025, a report from the South China Morning Post generated immediate and widespread international attention by detailing the scale of China's interest in transforming Turkey's railway system. The source of the information was not an anonymous industry leak or a speculative projection. It was Burak Dalioğlu, the president of Turkey's official government investment promotion agency, Invest in Turkey, speaking on the record to journalists. China, Dalolu confirmed, is interested in participating in approximately $60 billion worth of railway upgrades across Turkey. Allow that figure to register properly for a moment. $60 billion. This is a sum larger than the entire annual gross domestic product of countries like Paraguay or Cambodia. It is one of the single largest proposed infrastructure investment figures that any two nations are currently discussing anywhere in the world. And it is not directed at multiple countries or distributed across a continental network. It is focused on the railway system of one nation. What exactly is encompassed within that figure? The proposed upgrades described by Dalolu span several major interconnected components, each of which addresses a specific weakness in Turkey's current railway capacity. The first and most foundational component is electrification. A substantial portion of Turkey's existing rail lines operate on diesel traction, a technology that is not merely outdated but actively limiting. Electrifying these lines would immediately increase achievable speeds, reduce per-kilometer operating costs, decrease carbon emissions, and bring Turkish railways into technical compatibility with the electrified networks of European Union member states that connect to Turkey's western border. This is the foundational upgrade upon which all other improvements depend. The second component involves new domestic route construction. Turkey's railway geography is characterized by significant unevenness. Certain regions and corridors are reasonably well served, while others lack meaningful rail connections. New line construction would close these gaps, create additional freight routing options that reduce congestion on existing arteries, and open previously underserved regions to the economic benefits of rail connectivity. The third component, and perhaps the one with the most dramatic symbolic and practical implications, is a new dedicated freight rail bridge across the Bosphorus in Istanbul. The geographic reality of Istanbul is unique in the entire world. It is a major city that physically occupies two continents simultaneously, with its European side and Asian side separated by the Bosphorus Strait. Currently, road traffic crosses via two major suspension bridges, and commuter passenger rail crosses via the Marmaray undersea tunnel. But for heavy freight, the containers and bulk goods that form the commercial backbone of international trade, crossing Istanbul remains a time-consuming logistical challenge that constrains the corridor's throughput. A dedicated freight rail crossing of the Bosphorus would transform Istanbul from a transit bottleneck into a true intercontinental crossing point, the physical embodiment of Turkey's aspiration to be where the world's commerce meets. The fourth component is a high-speed rail connection between Istanbul and Ankara. This is not merely a passenger convenience, though it would substantially benefit Turkey's millions of domestic rail travelers. It represents the kind of modern, high-capacity rail backbone that signals a country's seriousness about positioning itself as a 21st-century logistics power. A fast, reliable, high-capacity Istanbul-Ankara spine would serve as the central nervous system of Turkey's upgraded network, supporting both the domestic economy and the international freight flows that the middle corridor is designed to carry. Additional routes under active consideration include connections from Sivas to Kars, extending the reach of the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway deeper into Turkey's Anatolian heartland. From Istanbul to Kapıkule at the Bulgarian border, providing the critical EU entry point upgrade, and from Ankara to the Aegean port city of Izmir. A high-speed passenger connection between Istanbul and the Mediterranean resort city of Antalya, capable of operating at speeds up to 250 kilometers per hour, has also been discussed as part of the broader modernization vision. Taken together as a comprehensive program, these upgrades represent something close to a wholesale reinvention of Turkey's national railway system. Not an incremental improvement, but a generational transformation. Turkey's state railway operator, TCDD, opened an international tender process in early 2025 for these projects. Dalolu was explicit that the process would be genuinely competitive. Chinese companies are welcome to bid, as are European manufacturers, Japanese firms, South Korean companies, and any other credible infrastructure providers. This competitive structure is strategically significant. It gives Turkey the leverage to extract better terms and provides Western partners with reassurance that the process is not simply a bilateral handover of national infrastructure to Chinese control. Among the Chinese firms already positioned to compete with particular advantage is CRRC Kishuyan Electric Locomotive, a major state-owned Chinese manufacturer that has already established a manufacturing presence inside Turkey. In 2024, this company generated significant attention when it introduced what it described as Istanbul's fastest metro train, a demonstration project that simultaneously showcased Chinese technical capability and gave CRRC the kind of local credibility and institutional relationships that international competitors without Turkish operations cannot easily replicate. To understand why China is prepared to discuss $60 billion for Turkey's railways, you need to understand how Beijing thinks about infrastructure investment at the strategic level. Because for China, infrastructure is never merely infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013 as the defining foreign policy project of his era, is simultaneously a development program, a commercial strategy, and a geopolitical instrument of the first order. By 2025, the BRI had touched more than 140 countries and involved financing and construction activity measured in the trillions of dollars across every inhabited continent. Roads, railways, deep-water ports, power generation facilities, digital networks, pipelines. China has been systematically building the physical connections that bind dozens of countries more tightly to Beijing's economic orbit, creating relationships of commercial dependency, generating goodwill through delivered infrastructure that host governments could not otherwise afford, and establishing Chinese equipment standards, Chinese operating systems, and Chinese institutional relationships across the foundational infrastructure of the modern global economy. Turkey was among the first nations to formally express support for the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2015, Ankara and Beijing signed a memorandum of understanding explicitly aligning the BRI with Turkey's own regional connectivity ambitions, what Turkish policymakers describe as their Middle Corridor Initiative. The two strategic visions were designed to reinforce each other from the beginning, but China's interest in Turkish railways is driven by something more specific and, honestly, more urgent than the general logic of BRI expansion. It is driven by a pressing need to reduce structural dependence on a single, politically compromised transit route to its most important export market. For years, roughly 90% or more of China's overland freight to Europe moved through Russia and Belarus, the Northern Corridor. That concentration of dependency has become deeply uncomfortable since February 2022. European buyers are nervous about supply chains visible on Russian territory. Sanctions frameworks have introduced uncertainty into transit arrangements. Russia's railway capacity has proven structurally inadequate for the volumes that China needs to move as its export economy continues to expand. And the possibility that the political situation could deteriorate further, that additional sanctions or Russia's own strategic decisions could disrupt the Northern Corridor further, creates ongoing anxiety that Chinese trade planners cannot ignore. In 2024, China-EU rail freight volumes through all corridors totaled 380,434 TEUs, a staggering increase of 80.2% compared to 2023. Flows specifically from China to Europe rose by 130.8%, reaching 330,748 TEUs. By early 2026, the momentum showed no signs of decelerating. In just the first 2 months of the year, the China-Europe Railway Express operated 3,501 freight trains carrying 352,000 TEUs, approximately 25% more than the equivalent period the previous year, according to China State Railway Group data. The network now connects 128 Chinese cities to 229 European destinations and more than 100 cities across Asia, and has surpassed 100,000 cumulative train journeys since its launch, carrying more than 11 million TEUs worth over $420 billion in goods. This is not a niche transport service catering to specialized cargo. This is a mainstream, strategically essential, rapidly growing global logistics system. And the system needs routes that are politically secure, physically capable, and independent of the geopolitical vulnerabilities that have plagued the Northern Corridor. The Middle Corridor through Turkey offers something that no alternative route can fully replicate: a path to European markets that is entirely free of Russian territory, entirely clear of the sanctions-related uncertainties associated with Belarus, and, once Turkey's railway infrastructure is adequately upgraded, genuinely competitive on transit time with the northern route that the Ukraine war has rendered problematic. For China, the $60 billion being discussed for Turkey's railway modernization is not philanthropic infrastructure development. It is strategic investment in the resilience of China's own export economy. It is the purchase of an alternative highway that will continue functioning regardless of what happens to Russia, regardless of what disruptions affect maritime shipping in the Red Sea or the Strait of Malacca, regardless of the further twists of a geopolitical environment that has proven repeatedly capable of generating surprises. In a world of compounding uncertainty, China is buying optionality, and $60 billion is, in Beijing's strategic calculus, a reasonable price for that kind of insurance. For Turkey, this deal is about something larger even than railway infrastructure or trade facilitation.